One of the most common reasons people shy away from buying XRP often boils down to one thing: the escrow. Many believe XRP isn't decentralized, assuming Ripple's control over the escrow makes the network centralized. I've had plenty of conversations with folks, especially those outside the crypto bubble, about why they avoid investing in an SRP. They're holding Bitcoin, maybe Ethereum, but won't touch XRP. Naturally, I ask why. Almost every time the response circles back to the same misconception: Ripple controls the network, so XRP must lack value. Or they assume Ripple is constantly dumping XRP onto the market, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Let's talk about the XRP escrow. Think of it as Ripple's war chest. Sure, Ripple unlocks 1 billion tokens each month. People panic, claiming it'll crash XRP's price when Ripple sells. But let's pause and dig a little deeper. If we actually examine how the escrow is managed, it's clear there's more to the story than meets the eye. Before we dive into the details, let's take a moment to talk about how much escrowed XRP is out there. Right now, it's sitting at around 36.5 billion XRP locked away out of the total 99.98 billion XRP available. And yes, we can actually track these escrow wallets. If you take a look, you'll see all the escrows listed with more details as you scroll down, but the key ones to focus on are the Ripple wallets. They're typically labeled as Ripple, making them easy to spot. Now, is this a big deal? Should we be worried about Ripple holding such a significant supply in escrow? Does this mean escrow is centralized? Absolutely not. Remember, this supply is escrowed. It's completely locked and untouchable until released. So no, it's not the red flag some might think it is. Some people argue that Ripple's large XRP holdings mean it's centralized, but let's clear this up. There are mechanisms built into the escrow that keep XRP fully decentralized, 100%, no doubt about it. We've covered this in depth before, featuring insights from David Schwartz and even Brad Garlinghouse. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Anderson's recent post sheds more light on the escrow and Ripple's role. Ripple owning a significant amount of XRP isn't a flaw, it's actually a feature. Why? Because it gives Ripple a huge financial incentive to drive XRP adoption, ensuring they're fully invested in its long-term success. Imagine Ripple holding little to no XRP. Why would they champion its adoption or prioritize it over other blockchains, aside from XRP's unique features? The truth is, having significant holdings of a cryptocurrency is the strongest driver for anyone, individual or company, to push for its growth. Think about the Ethereum mafia during those shadowy ICO days, or Michael Saylor's relentless Bitcoin advocacy. Would they still have been so loud if they didn't hold substantial stakes? Doubtful, right? Now, consider this. A former Ripple insider who led XRP markets and liquidity efforts sheds light on why Ripple's large XRP holdings are a game changer for both Ripple and XRP's adoption. Want to know the real reason this tight relationship matters? Watch the video below and see how it all clicks into place. This isn't just some random theory I cooked up. It's based on insights straight from Ripple insiders. Here's the scoop. Miguel pointed out that Ripple's massive XRP reserves give them a unique advantage. Unlike Bitcoin, Ripple can lend XRP to professional market makers at unbeatable rates. Why does that matter? Well, if there's a cross-vendor payment corridor that's too expensive or not liquid enough for seamless transactions, Ripple can step in. By leveraging their XRP stash, they can cover the cost gap and incentivize usage through their on-demand liquidity ODL platform. Think of it as jump-starting a car. With Ripple's resources, these corridors gain traction, and over time, as volume increases and liquidity improves, Ripple won't need to subsidize anymore. Miguel also broke it down for those still scratching their heads. More liquidity equals more utility, and in theory, that increased utility makes XRP more valuable. It's a simple equation, but one that XRP critics seem to overlook. So if you're still doubting XRP's potential, maybe it's time to take another look.
We own 60 billion XRP, the company. I get it. I don't know that Bitcoin or Ethereum is that much more decentralized in terms of holdings. Right? I think Vitalik has a fair bit of Ethereum, right? So does Joe Lubin. The early Bitcoiners have tons, right? I saw some study of the day that like 90% of the holdings are 10% of the wallets in Bitcoin and Ethereum, some crazy thing like that. So it's a little more private, right? I think ours is a little more public, especially because the company holds so much. What I would say is it puts us in a very interesting position with respect to economics, because number one, so my job is building liquidity. One of the ways you do that is you lend XRP to people so that they can provide liquidity in markets. If you want to provide a bid and an offer in a market, you have to have cash to buy something. And if you want to sell it, you have to have the thing to sell. Well, the only way you sell something is either own it or you borrow it. In the Bitcoin space, it's really hard to borrow stuff. It's expensive, 10 to 15% annual interest rates, and it's hard to find like really chunky loans. With XRP, people can just come to us and be like, hey, I want to borrow some XRP. Not anybody, but really professional market makers. It's something that we can do that nobody else can do, right? In that flow that I described, where somebody's buying XRP, moving it, and selling it, we can guarantee the rates. So everybody always asks me, it's like, well, but you're bridging between two fiat currencies. Like, you have to do two hops, there's two spreads you're crossing, the liquidity's not great, it's volatile. No problem. I will pay you the difference. If you're going across this rail and it's expensive, I am very much incentivized to make sure that you do that, because the more liquidity, the more utility, in theory, over time, the more valuable XRP will be. So in the short run, we're very much incentivized to make all those frictions go away. So I don't see our holdings as a detriment, and I definitely do not care if there are skeptics. We're skeptics about everything. But it puts us in an incredibly powerful position to actually activate the use case.
He's absolutely right here, no doubt about it. When we talk about decentralization, it's easy to see numbers like 36 billion and jump to conclusions. At first glance, you might think, whoa, 36 billion? Ripple holds a massive chunk, definitely centralized, not decentralized, but let's break that down. The same argument is often made about Bitcoin or Ethereum. Take Bitcoin, for example. People claiming it's decentralized might forget about the big players involved. Look at the mining companies. Most of the top ones have major shareholders like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Even ETFs tied to Bitcoin trace back to these big names. So whether it's XRP, Bitcoin, or Ethereum, centralization debates often come down to who's really holding the power behind the curtain. All right, so now we've got heavyweights like BlackRock and Fidelity stepping into the Bitcoin ETF arena, becoming some of the biggest players in the game. Does that mean Bitcoin is centralized by default? Some might say yes. Throw in the fact that just 3 or 4 miners control the majority of the hash rate power, and the argument starts to gain traction. And let's not forget the wallet distribution. When the top 10 or even the top 100 wallets own such a massive chunk of the supply, it's easy to see why people question decentralization. But here's the thing. Debates about centralization versus decentralization in crypto often spiral way out of control, creating more noise than clarity. XRP has stood the test of time, and there's no denying its success. Its longevity is driven not just by its utility, but also by Ripple's relentless efforts to champion it. Ripple has worked tirelessly for years to make XRP a major player, and it shows. Meanwhile, Crypto Area brings us an interesting update. May 9th, SBI Audio shareholder presentation clips. Here's the scoop. XRP held in escrow by Ripple Labs won't factor into the company's value until a clear valuation emerges, possibly through an IPO or similar. Ripple is also sitting on a mountain of unrealized profits. Intrigued? Dive in and check it out.
Ripple Lab is held as unlisted shares. The value of XRP held in escrow by Ripple Lab will not be included in the corporate value until a clear valuation is determined through an IPO or other means. If it is included, the profit will surge and will be an extraordinary amount. So assets under management for private equity was approximately 900 billion. We would like to bring it close to 1 trillion as soon as possible for the crypto asset business. Like mentioned earlier, this is a record high in performance. Ever since Mr. Trump was inaugurated, the U.S. has been putting a lot of emphasis on the crypto asset market, which we are grateful for. The reason why we did invest into Ripple more than 10 years ago, which is now generating a huge amount of unrealized profits. If listed, the unrealized profits are going to be unlocked, and I'm sure that it will easily exceed 1 trillion yen. So this is something that may happen. I thought it was a little too early to advance into these segments, but it wasn't. There aren't as many people who understand our operations. Even our employees do not understand our entire business. So maybe general investors do not understand our business perfectly.
It's been a long time since we have invested in a company called Ripple, maybe 10 years. So what is happening to this investment? This is now generating enormous amount of profit. XRP is a currency issued by Ripple. Market cap right now, so XRP is circulating the market, is about 20 trillion yen now. So this is 58.55 billion XRP, which is equivalent to 20 trillion in market cap. And there are still currently Ripple's holdings are not in circulation. That's still under escrow. This is how much. It's right here. So we have about a little less than 10% of the equity stake of Ripple.
Here's something fascinating to dive into. We can see the max supply of XRP alongside Ripple's current holdings that aren't yet in circulation, including the XRP under escrow. What's intriguing here is how all this is being calculated. Right now, the value of XRP held in escrow isn't factored into Ripple's corporate value, at least not until there's a clear valuation through something like an IPO or other financial mechanisms. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Digital asset investors shared a post shedding light on this. And once you hear the clip, the idea of crypto price controls doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore. Think about it. Just as we use the petroleum stockpile to influence global oil prices, could a similar mechanism apply to crypto? It's definitely a concept worth exploring. We buy and sell strategically to influence global prices, leveraging our reserves. This gives us both offensive and defensive tools to safeguard the dollar in the evolving digital economy. What we're subtly suggesting here is fascinating. Yes, XRP could theoretically be assigned a specific value. Now consider this. If banks adopted Ripple and needed to buy XRP, wouldn't they aim to keep its market price low? And with XRP being finite, unable to be minted, couldn't that slow widespread adoption? David Schwartz addressed this directly, saying no. In fact, the price of XRP required to make a $1 million payment will always equal $1 million. The reality is quite the opposite of what you might expect. Higher prices often go hand in hand with greater liquidity, which translates to lower payment costs. Essentially, a higher price asset becomes a more efficient tool for handling payments, especially when it comes to high value transactions. But here's the big question. Could XRP reach a point of adoption where its price is intentionally influenced or managed to ensure greater liquidity and cheaper payments? It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. With XRP's reserves and influence, this scenario could easily become a reality. Imagine a system where liquidity soars, payments flow seamlessly, and transaction costs drop to near nothing. Intriguing, right? Now, let's dive deeper into what this could mean.
Candidate Trump talked about was his frustration with the Biden administration that after they'd seize the crypto, they'd sell the crypto. And he said, look, had they held on to the crypto, we would have billions of dollars that we could use to pay down government debt and otherwise. So he complained that government shouldn't be selling seized crypto. That raises then two issues: crypto stockpiles and crypto reserves, and they have a slight different connotation. Since the beginning of time, we know, going back to ancient Egypt, governments have been stockpiling commodities. Ancient Egypt stockpiled wheat and corn. Today, governments like the United States, like China, stockpile an enormous amount of commodities. China stockpiles pork, stockpiles rebar, stockpiles copper, stockpiles petroleum. The United States stockpiles and reserves petroleum. So governments do this with commodities all the time. They do it for various purposes. The simple one is simply in times of need, they can release the stockpile and it can be used by citizens. But they also use it for strategic purposes. The United States petroleum stockpile is more than a stockpile. It's actually a reserve. And here's where a reserve is different than a stockpile. It's used for strategic purposes. We use our petroleum stockpile to actually adjust the world price of petroleum. We buy and sell to affect the global price. The Biden administration sold down our petroleum reserve dramatically to attempt to bring down the price of oil running into the last election. Since the dollar is in part based upon the global price, there's also a monetary impact. And that's why the Trump administration has says we are going to stockpile different currencies, different cryptos, but we're going to reserve Bitcoin. And the reason why we're going to reserve and use Bitcoin strategically for monetary policy purposes is because a number of countries have announced they are going to experiment with a new digital currency that's based upon Bitcoin. And so by having a reserve, we now have both an offensive and defensive capability to protect the dollar in a new global digital world. So it shows a lot of strategic thinking and also recognition that Bitcoin is moved into the realm of being having monetary policy impact. You know, from the beginning of history, most currencies have been stabilized with a commodity. Often that commodity is a metal commodity, silver or gold. It's only in the last 50 years or so, since the United States went off the gold standard in the 1970s, that the United States has experimented with having a true fiat currency not anchored to any commodity. Now, some commentators will argue that no, the dollar still remains based upon a petroleum commodity, but it's still a physical commodity. When in 2017, as chairman of the CFTC, I greenlighted the world's first Bitcoin futures, we were focused on the fact that in the future, commodities, not just physical commodities, but in fact, digital commodities may become anchors for currencies. And I wanted to make sure that the global Bitcoin price was set in dollars, not in any other currency, because the time may come when once again we return to a commodity stabilizer for our money, but this time around that commodity may be a digital commodity, not a physical commodity.
Here's an intriguing insight from Chris Giancarlo. Picture this: when it comes to the strategic reserve and stockpile, we're not just talking about petroleum anymore. XRP plays a role too. Think about it. With XRP included in the strategic stockpile, it could be used much like oil, adjusting global pricing, or even setting a fixed value. But here's where it gets interesting. It could also become a tool of influence, a weapon of sorts in the digital economy. Now, while it's clear there's no plan to expand the stockpile with more digital assets right now, who knows? The landscape is constantly changing, and over time, strategies might evolve. It's possible that Ripple might even gift XRP to the US government, an interesting scenario to consider. But for now, we'll have to wait and see how Ripple plays its cards with that massive war chest. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more exciting content coming your way. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned. Peace.